Hey guys, alright, today we are watching a kind of Indian history video. This time, how did Britain conquer India? Animated history by Armchair historian. Now, this is actually a time period of Indian history that I kind of know. Mainly because... It was a year ago now. Crap! I took a class a year ago where we learned about modern Britain, modern British history. So it was like 1700s to mid 1900s to end of colonialism. Yeah, to the 1970s or something. And in that we spent like a good month or so on Indian history a little bit. Not Indian history, but, British in India. And how Britain conquered India, well, it's very complex. Initially, it was the British East India Company that started off in India, making deals and scheming and such with the local people, local kings and empires like the Mughals in India, and eventually working their way in. And then eventually, the British East India Company had complete control over the entire subcontinent. And the British East India Company had control over India for much of the 1800s, up until the 1870s or 80s, I think was when they were dissolved. Sometime after the Indian Rebellion of 1857 did the British government take control from the British East India Company, and India became directly under the control of the British monarchy, or just the British government in general. And that is a TLDR of how Britain conquered India. Let's get a little bit of a deeper dive from Armchair Historian here.
The Armchair Historian. Today's episode, how the British Empire was able to assert control over India.
Prime and low.
I wonder if they'll be talking about the rebellion of 1857 in this video, because that was a very important turning point in that colonial history. I don't think I've seen this intro before.
The Indian subcontinent was subjugated by an island more than 20 times smaller in size.
Yeah.
This unimaginable conquest of what would become the jewel in the British crown greatly empowered the British Empire. By the middle of the 19th century, British rule led to a new wave of South Asian nationalist movements, the effects to which are still felt to this day. But we're not going to be delving into too much detail about the consequences of British rule. Rather, our goal is to evaluate what actions taken by the British and Indians alike paved the way for British rule in the first place. In order to understand how the British were able to take control of India, we need to go back to New Year's Eve on 1600, well into the reign of Elizabeth I.
Going all the way back
It was
there,
her signature on a royal charter granted to a group of adventure merchants, later known as the East India Company, that would change the destinies of two nations forever. However, at the time, the company's leaders were not yet interested in trading directly with the reigning Indian power of the time. Instead, they focused on competing with the Dutch, French, and Portuguese in the East Indies. But over time, the East India Company, after being driven out of the East Indies, shifted its focus onto the Indian subcontinent. In 1640, a company representative succeeded in securing a grant of land in southern India, a pivotal moment, as it marked the first time that Indian land was owned directly by the English. It was on this land that they constructed Fort St. George. The settlement that grew around this region became the thriving city of Madras, now known as Chennai, and home to over 7 million people. As more and more company-owned forts and settlements sprang up all over the Indian subcontinent, the English became a leading exporter of spices, which, in the words of Brian Gardner, author of the East India Company, had a considerable place in life. Men were prepared to die in search of them, and many did. No gift was more acceptable, and to be well supplied was a mark of status. Wealth could be measured in spices.
True.
The French, Danish, and Dutch all became similarly active in Indian affairs from the 17th century onwards, with the Portuguese already established in the region. Joining me now is our good friend History with Hilbert, who will be providing us with some background information on the Mughal Empire.
As the 18th century commenced, the Europeans became increasingly involved in Indian affairs. They could afford to, because the Mughal Empire, which once ruled over not just the majority of India, but also parts of modern-day Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh, was on the decline in the wake of very costly wars of conquest. The Mughals suffered from repeated invasions by Persians, Afghans, and other Indians. In 1739, the Mughal capital, Delhi, was sacked by the Persian ruler Nader Shah, following the decisive Battle of Kurnool, and in 1748, Nader Shah's protege, the Afghan Ahmed Shah Durrani, also led his armies into Mughal territory, beginning his own invasion. Due to these factors, by the middle of the 18th century, the Mughal emperor took the role of a figurehead to many new empowered local rulers. If you'd like to check out my video that goes into more detail about the Mughals, then follow the link in the description below.
Thanks for joining us again, Hilbert. As the Mughals weakened, the Maratha kingdom in the central west of India was carving out an empire of its own. Despite never eclipsing the Mughal Empire at its height, the Maratha Empire remained as a dominant power in India for another 80 years or so. As all of this was happening, the East India Company began to overshadow its European competitors, devoting substantial profits to raising a private army in an effort to contend with the Maratha Empire and Bengal. By now, the East India Company benefited greatly from the country's imposing navy, which enabled it to ferry more and more men to India than its European competitors. As much as the company's military aided in its growth, it was the laissez-faire policy that won over many local rulers to their side, many of whom benefited financially from their dealings with the company and did not perceive their sovereignty to be at risk. Of all the Europeans who had established themselves in India, the British and French based in the south were now preeminent. But under the daring Robert Clive, the British East India Company's army was able to defeat both the Bengalese and their French allies at the Battle of Plassey during the 7 Years' War, which, by the 1760s, allowed them to assert control over much of the Indian subcontinent unchecked through direct territorial possession or indirect tributary arrangements. To quote Gardner once more, by the Treaty of Paris, 1763, the French forts taken by the company were returned to them, some of them having been razed to the ground. But the French never recovered, and only 6 years later, the French East India Company collapsed, although the stations remained in the possession of France. During the British advance into the Indian heartland, it encountered staunch resistance from the Sikh Empire and other Indian states not interested in doing business with the English. The Duke of Wellington, who would later go on to defeat Napoleon, won several victories against these states while aiding his brother Richard Wellesley, who acted as Governor General of India. Consequently, by the turn of the 19th century, the Wellesley brothers had succeeded in leaving behind them the foundations of an empire greater even that of Akbar himself.
Admiral, we have enemy ships in sector 47.
It's a trap!
As the middle of the 19th century drew closer, an Indian national consciousness began to take form, as company rule resulted in a wider array of social and economic reforms being demanded from increasingly alienated local rulers. These sentiments culminated in the Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny, which was brutally suppressed and concluded with the formal dissolution of the Mughal Empire and the...
Which, by the way, some of the... one of the ways in which the British suppressed this rebellion was following the surrender of the rebels. They shot I believe it was living bodies out of cannons. And for their religion, that is very sacrilegious. Like it has their religion, their culture. When someone dies, there's something about the body is very important. I can't remember the specifics, but you know, the British essentially were arguably directly attacking the Sepoy religion or culture.
The transfer of power from the British East India Company to Britain itself. Power now rested in the hands of the British Crown directly, and as the 19th century continued, India's resources and the livelihoods of its people were exploited to fuel the Industrial Revolution in Britain, leading to a series of famines which shook the Indian economy to the core and left millions of Indians dead. One thing was certain. The British Empire now had millions of new subjects under its rule in India, and imperial expansion wouldn't stop there. To conclude, the political vacuum left by the Mughal Empire in the wake of repeated invasions, the failure of other Indian states, particularly the Maratha Empire, to fill that vacuum and unify India, the failure of other European powers to stop the British, Britain's military and industrial superiority, and the governing policy of the East India Company allowed Britain to take over the Indian subcontinent. Now back to our sponsor.
That was a good video. Let's go to that final map here of the British Empire of 1919. Ooh, nice. They've got the port cities mapped out here, and a little bit of the islands. They got the Falklands. They missing anything? No, they've even got Belize. Yeah, right. That's Belize, right? Ooh, they even got these little. They got the islands of the Mediterranean. Very nice, very nice. I don't know what else to add here at the end. This was a great video. The amount of information that he was able to squeeze in here, and still provide excellent explanations. Like, just, this is amazing. Chef's kiss. I loved it, Armchair Historian. I loved it. I literally have. He did everything like right. Like, obviously he could have gone into greater explanation on certain things, but that would mean the video would be longer. This is a 7-minute video on the British conquering India, so he didn't really need to go. He couldn't go in depth more without it just being a longer video. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. I hope you guys did too. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.